There is something that happens every night that almost no one is aware of. A closing, a deliberate interference with the access point that connects your inner world to the field of creative reality. Jesus knew about it. He named the forces responsible. He described their function, their motivation, and most importantly, he left behind the exact Aramaic key that breaks through their interference every single time it is used correctly. This is not mythology. It is not metaphor. In the Gnostic tradition preserved alongside the canonical Gospels in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in the oldest layers of Aramaic sacred teaching, these forces have a name, Archons, and their primary function is precisely what you would expect from any system designed to maintain control. They block access to what would make you free. What Jesus taught his closest disciples about navigating this blockage was never included in the standardized Bible, but it was preserved, and it begins with understanding what this gate actually is, why it matters, and why certain words spoken in a specific way are the only thing that opens it. The Archons. What Jesus actually said, the word archon comes from the Greek and means ruler or authority, but in the cosmological framework that Jesus operated within, it referred to something far more specific than political power. In the tradition preserved in Gnostic texts, many of which were deliberately excluded from the canonical Bible at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, archons are described as intermediary beings that occupy the space between human consciousness and direct access to the divine source. They are not evil in the absolute sense. They are functionaries, agents of a system designed to keep human awareness operating within a narrow band of perception, below the threshold at which direct creative power becomes available. Jesus referenced these forces repeatedly, though the translations have softened or obscured his language significantly. In the Gospel of John, he referred to the ruler of this world in Greek, hoarchon, to cosmou, as a distinct entity whose domain he was actively working against. In the Gospel of Thomas, preserved outside the canonical record, he was more explicit still, describing layers of guardians that the soul must navigate, each requiring specific knowledge, specific words, and specific states of inner preparation to pass through. This is not the Jesus of Sunday school. This is a teacher operating within a cosmological framework of extraordinary complexity and precision, one in which the path to freedom was not belief, but knowledge, not passive faith, but active navigation. What makes this immediately relevant to the present moment is that the Archon framework is not merely cosmological. It is practical. The Archons do not block access to the divine source through supernatural force. They block it through the mechanisms of ordinary human consciousness, through fear, through distraction, through the fragmentation of attention, and the noise of conflicting inner voices that prevents the coherent inner state from which sacred Aramaic words draw their power. To break through is not to defeat an external enemy. It is to achieve, through specific practice, the inner coherence that their interference is designed to prevent. The gate and what lies behind it in the Aramaic cosmological tradition. The gate is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of a threshold state, a point in human consciousness at which the ordered, fragmented, noise-filled awareness of daily life gives way to something qualitatively different. The tradition has many names for what lies on the other side of that threshold. The kingdom, the pleroma, the field of living light, the space from which intention and reality are not yet separated. Jesus called it the kingdom of heaven, but in Aramaic, the word translated as heaven is Shmaya, which does not refer to a location above the clouds. It refers to a state of vibrational alignment, a dimension of reality that coexists with the physical world but operates at a frequency that ordinary consciousness cannot access. The gate is the transition point between these two states, and like any threshold it has two sides, one characterized by the noise, fear, and fragmentation that the archonic system maintains, and the other characterized by the coherent, luminous, creative stillness from which the sacred words draw their full power. The tradition is explicit. You cannot speak Ephatha from the fragmented side of the gate and expect full results. The word carries the instruction to open, but it must be spoken from a place that is already, at least partially, on the other side of what it is opening. This is the paradox at the heart of the practice, and it is precisely the paradox that the archonic interference is designed to perpetuate. What Jesus taught, and what the tradition preserved, is that this paradox is navigable. There is a preparation practice, a specific sequence of inner movements that carries the practitioner through the gate, regardless of what the archonic interference is doing. It does not require perfection. It does not require years of prior practice. It requires understanding the structure of the interference, the architecture of the gate, and the specific Aramaic words that correspond to each layer of the threshold. And the first of those words, the one that begins every crossing, is the same word Jesus spoke over the deaf man in the Gospel of Mark. How the blocking works, and why night matters. The archonic interference is not random. It follows a pattern that anyone who has ever tried to maintain a serious spiritual practice will recognize immediately. The sudden onset of exhaustion exactly when you sit down to practice. The intrusive thoughts that arrive with unusual force the moment you attempt inner stillness. The inexplicable sense of heaviness or disconnection that settles over you precisely when you are closest to something real. This is not imagination. The tradition is explicit that this interference intensifies at specific times and the period of night. Particularly, the threshold between waking and sleep is the most significant of all. In the Aramaic framework, the transition into sleep is one of the primary access points to the field that lies beyond the gate. During this threshold state, what modern neuroscience describes as the hypnagogic state, the liminal zone between full waking consciousness and sleep, the ordinary filtering mechanisms of the mind relax, the noise decreases. The gate becomes briefly, naturally, more permeable. And it is precisely at this moment that the archonic interference reaches its peak intensity, because this is when the practitioner is most vulnerable to simply sliding into unconscious sleep rather than crossing the threshold with awareness and intention. Jesus described this dynamic directly in the parable of the 10 virgins, 5 of whom had oil in their lamps, and 5 of whom did not. At midnight, the moment of maximum darkness and threshold, the call came. Those who were prepared crossed through. Those who were not missed the moment entirely. This parable is not about virtue. It is about preparation, the specific inner preparation that allows a practitioner to remain conscious and operative at the exact moment the gate opens. The oil in the lamps is not metaphorical generosity. In the Aramaic tradition, it refers to the accumulated coherent inner energy that sustained practice produces, the very resource that the archonic interference is designed, through distraction and fragmentation, to continuously drain. The chosen ones. What that actually means, the phrase chosen ones, has been so thoroughly appropriated by ego-driven spiritual culture that it has become almost meaningless, or worse, a marker of the very archonic fragmentation it was originally meant to describe. In the Aramaic tradition, the chosen are not chosen by divine favoritism. They are not a special class of human beings granted access that others are denied. The Aramaic word from which this concept derives, baikair, carries the meaning of those who have been sifted, refined, clarified, like grain separated from chaff, like metal purified in fire. The choosing is not external selection. It is internal refinement, a process that anyone can undergo, and that produces, as its result, the coherent inner state from which the gate becomes accessible. What distinguishes the chosen ones, in this precise sense, is not spiritual superiority, but practical knowledge. They know the structure of the interference. They know the architecture of the gate. They know the specific words, sounds, and inner postures that navigate the threshold regardless of what the archonic system is doing around them. This knowledge was transmitted directly, teacher to student. In the oral tradition that the sacred Aramaic lineage preserved across generations, it was not written down, not because it was being deliberately hidden from the Messiah, but because its essential component, the correct sound, cannot be transmitted through writing. A written word is a map. The actual word, spoken correctly, is the territory. Jesus made this explicit in his distinction between those who heard his teaching as parables and those who received the deeper explanation directly. The parables were not dumbed-down versions of the truth for ordinary people. They were vibrational containers, stories whose structure produced a specific inner effect in listeners, preparing the ground for the seed of direct knowledge that would come later for those who remained, who asked, who pressed further. The chosen ones are those who press further, not because they are better, but because they are ready. And because readiness, in this tradition, is something you actively cultivate, not something that happens to you. The Aramaic key that breaks through every layer of the gate corresponds to a specific form of interference, and every form of interference has a specific Aramaic response. This is the practical heart of what Jesus preserved and what the tradition maintained with such care across the centuries. It is not a general teaching about positivity or faith or the power of belief. It is a precise, layered protocol, a sequence of inner movements and spoken words that address each layer of the archonic blockage in turn, systematically dissolving the interference and restoring the coherent inner state from which the threshold becomes passable. The first layer is the layer of fragmentation, the scattered, noise-filled awareness that the archonic system maintains through the constant demands of ordinary life. The Aramaic response to this layer begins not with a word, but with a breath. A specific pattern of breath that the tradition describes as drawing the scattered particles of awareness back into a single point. This is not pranayama borrowed from the East, though the principles are related. It is a specifically Aramaic technique embedded in the sacred oral tradition that uses the resonance of the breath itself as the first instrument of coherence before any word is spoken. Every layer of the gate corresponds to a specific form of interference, and every form of interference has a specific Aramaic response. This is the practical heart of what Jesus preserved and what the tradition maintained with such care across the centuries. It is not a general teaching about positivity or faith or the power of belief. It is a precise, layered protocol, a sequence of inner movements and spoken words that address each layer of the blockage, in turn systematically dissolving the interference and restoring the coherent inner state from which the threshold becomes passable. The first layer is the layer of fragmentation, the scattered, noise-filled awareness that the archonic system maintains through the constant demands of ordinary life. The Aramaic response to this layer begins not with a word, but with a breath, a specific pattern of breath that the tradition describes as drawing the scattered particles of awareness back into a single point. This is not pranayama borrowed from the East, though the principles are related. It is a specifically Aramaic technique, embedded in the sacred oral tradition, that uses the resonance of the breath itself as the first instrument of coherence before any word is spoken. The second layer is the layer of doubt, the subtle but persistent inner voice that questions whether any of this is real, whether the gate exists, whether the words actually do anything. This is where Hermeneuta becomes not just a concept, but an active practice, a deliberate inner movement toward the load-bearing certainty that needs no external proof. And this is precisely where Ephatha enters, spoken not outwardly, into the physical space, but inwardly, directed at the closed condition of doubt itself. Be opened, not as a wish, as a command issued from the part of you that already knows the gate is real, already knows the words work, already stands in its deepest nature on the other side of every blockage that has ever tried to keep it contained. The most direct application of this understanding is also the in the final moments before sleep, when the hypnagogic threshold opens and the archonic interference reaches its peak, the practitioner speaks, Ephatha once, aloud or in a strong inner voice directed not outward into the room but inward, toward the gate itself, not as a prayer, not as a wish, as a command issued from the part of you that already stands on the other side of every closing that has ever tried to contain it. The word means be opened and at the threshold of sleep. With the gate narrowing and the interference pressing in, there is no more precise or powerful instruction you can give to reality than exactly that. Those who have worked with this word in this way consistently report the same experience, a sudden expansion of inner space, a deepening of stillness, and a quality of crossing, not falling into sleep, but moving through it with awareness intact. This is what the chosen ones preserved. This is what the Archons work every night to prevent. And this is what one Aramaic word, spoken correctly at the right moment, has always been able to restore. What Jesus warned about was not abstract. The forces that block access to the deepest layers of human creative and spiritual potential are real, not supernatural monsters, but systematic patterns of interference that operate through the very mechanisms of ordinary consciousness. Fear, distraction, fragmentation, the exhaustion that arrives at the moment of deepest potential. These are not random. They are the working surface of a system that has functioned for a very long time and that is extraordinarily good at what it does. But the key that breaks through them is older than the system. Ifata, Biopa, is not a modern innovation. It is a word that has been spoken at thresholds for longer than the interference has existed, in a language whose architecture was specifically designed to produce coherent, vibrational force from the human voice. Enanar Nura Ayam, the light, is the recognition that restores the practitioner to their actual nature, the one that knows. Archonic interference can permanently obscure, the one that the chosen ones have always found their way back to, regardless of how complete the darkness seemed. The gate is real. The interference is real. The key is real. And the tradition that preserved all three, the complete sound, the full meaning, and the precise protocol of use, is now available in a form that anyone who has felt the pull of this knowledge can access and begin working with today. The complete teaching of the first two sacred Aramaic words, Ephatha and Enan Nura, their power, correct sound, and full protocol of use, is now available. If this touched something in you, let it be known. Leave a comment below. Hit like and subscribe so this knowledge keeps reaching you. Check the first comment to access it.